Fukuyama, Political Order and Political Decay, chapters 1 through 4, lecture 2. In this lecture, I'm going to be talking about chapters 2 and 3, which is on dimensions of development and on the state and bureaucracy. So in the previous class, we just had a kind of an overview of the book to come and the institutions that he's talking about. Now, in chapter 2, in Dimensions of Political Development, he's talking about the different factors within society that have to be taken into account in order to understand the developmental paths that their institutions can or do move down. And here there's a graphic actually on page 43, which is very helpful. These are the different dimensions of development, where you see you have on the bottom, you have the three specifically political institutions: the state, rule of law, and democracy. And then outside of that, you have three other social factors that can have an effect on how those institutions develop. And that's economic growth, the presence or absence and the kind of growth; social mobilization, that is the different groups that exist or emerge within society and their ability to engage in collective action; and then you have the development of ideas, especially ideas concerning legitimacy. So all of those factors can interact with one another in various ways when talking about the developmental path of one country or another. Now, he's not obviously giving any kind of predictive theory. Much like Why Nations Fail, he's trying to lay out what the fundamental factors are that explain the development of a state. And he will talk about how different developmental sequences will place particular constraints on how countries can develop, but he's not developing any kind of predictive theory. Now, when you're talking about economic development, economic development is usually measured in something like the development of per capita GDP over time, right? So the gross domestic product, the value of the economic output of a country in a given year, and then divided by the size of the population, so that you have the per capita gross domestic product. That's usually the way, that's kind of like the proxy measurement for economic development, this sort of increase in productive capacity and the production of value. And the economic growth and economic change will lead to social mobilization, to the emergence of new groups with collective interests or collective identities, right? Obviously, there's a continuum here. Some groups may be more cohesive than others. But in general, you're talking about new groups with new collective interests. This could be students, various non-governmental organizations, or the emergence of the middle class, or the bourgeoisie, the industrial working class. So economic changes, material changes within society will lead to reconfiguring of the groups in society, which can lead to political changes. But you also have the potential for the development of ideas. Especially, again, ideas related to legitimacy. And here, the primary thing he has in mind is the spread of the ideas of rights and consent, so the way in which kind of democratic ideas or ideals become politically important for collective action. But also another idea that develops in the modern era is nationalism, which is different from sort of old-fashioned patriotism. Nationalism is, on a large scale, is kind of a product of the French Revolution and thereafter. So you can have changes in ideas, and those ideas change the way people conceive of themselves, conceive of their interests, and how they mobilize, to the extent that they're able to mobilize to bring about political change. So we've got lots of things. So that figure, figure 1 on page 43, is meant to incorporate all those different factors. There it is, one last time. Now, on page 43, he begins a section called How the World Changed After 1800. And here, of course, the big story is industrialization. And you can just take a look at this picture, figure 2 on page 44. Real income per person in England from 1200 AD to 2000. And you see how it just takes off beginning in the 1800s with industrialization. So the way in which the amount of prosperity, the amount of wealth in societies goes up exponentially as a result of industrialization. And this leads to broad social upheaval of the sort that is described by Karl Marx on page 45, one of my favorite quotations from the Communist Manifesto, because I just assume everybody has a favorite quotation from the Communist Manifesto, and here's mine. The bourgeoisie cannot exist without constantly revolutionizing the instruments of production, and thereby the relations of production, and with them the whole relations of society. Conservation of the old modes of production in unaltered form was, on the contrary, the first condition of existence for all earlier industrial classes. I don't know why you'd say necessarily industrial here, but he's kind of talking about how, in the Middle Ages, early modern period, there was kind of a focus on preservation and stability, whether you're talking about the guilds, merchants, or what have you. Whereas when capitalism develops, where you're dealing with technological innovation, creative destruction, new ways of doing things, the pursuit of wealth leads to the pursuit of novelty, of changing the way that things are produced. And as Marx notes here, and he's obviously not the only one to note this, that when you change what's being made and how it's being made, that's not just a technical change, because obviously all that making is being done by human beings, right? So economic production involves people in particular social relations. And so when you revolutionize the economy, you change the way people live, you change the society. People leave the countryside and go to the city. They go from being yeoman farmers to industrial workers, right? They go from, being sort of agricultural or farmer types to being middle class, middle managers, whatever it is. So when you change the economy, you change the society. Constant revolutionizing of production, uninterrupted disturbance of all social conditions, everlasting uncertainty and agitation distinguish the bourgeois epoch from all earlier ones. All fixed, fast-frozen relations, with their train of ancient and venerable prejudices and opinions, are swept away. All newly formed ones become antiquated before they can ossify. All that is solid melts into air. All that is holy is profaned, and man is at last compelled to face with sober senses his real conditions of life and his relations with his kind. End of quotation. That's from 1848, Communist Manifesto. Obviously, as probably a lot of you know, if you read 19th century British literature, one of the underlying themes of a lot of 19th century British novels is the way in which industrialization is causing the rise of this new class and the decline of the old aristocracy, with all the various social tensions and comedies of manners or tragedies of manners that accompany that. So you have big economic growth beginning in the 1800s, which puts society into upheaval. You also have incipient globalization, to a large extent driven by colonialism in the 19th century, but it still becomes relatively dense. And you have the spread of institutions to new places, right? So you have development by mimicry, not just because of internal dynamics. So here he's talking about the way in which the basic structure of government kind of develops in Europe and gets adopted in other places, so that you have more traditional forms of governing get replaced by more modern, ultimately Western-inspired modes of government. And so that becomes an important factor in political development with a lot of nations. And so just one other thing from one other quotation from this chapter on page 47, because it's a very helpful one in talking about all this. The first big paragraph on page 47. He says, the conditions in which political development occurred after 1800 were very different from those that prevailed in the preceding periods covered in the first volume of this book. So in other words, most of human history. Continuous economic growth, with rapidly driving new forms of social mobilization, creating new actors who then demanded participation in the political system. At the same time, ideas could spread from one society to another at the speed of the printing press, or later the telegraph, telephone, radio, and eventually the internet. Political order under these new conditions became highly problematic as institutions developed to manage agrarian societies now presided over industrialized ones. And so, the way in which kind of these rapid transformations create these political tensions and political problems. And he ends the chapter by noting, he says that it's not the case that all good things don't always go together. And by this, what he means is simply that there is not one way for a country to modernize. Countries modernize in different ways. And again, his primary concern is with the way that the sequence of institutional development can differ from one country to another in such a way that you can't simply assume that all countries are on a path towards social, economic, and political modernization. But that's really enough about that chapter. So let's move on to chapter 3, which is entitled Bureaucracy. This begins on page 52. For around the world, for many people, the big political concern has been for a while now the limiting of overly powerful or tyrannical governments. Right? That's been a big focus of political mobilization, is trying to limit the arbitrary or tyrannical powers of governments, whether it's in the name of human rights or greater democracy, or even it's just simply out of self-protection. This kind of movement to limit government has been very important. But of course, the thing is that before you can limit the state, you need to have a state that is capable of governing, and you can't take the state for granted. You can't take for granted that there is a competent state there for you to limit. And he gives the example of India here, that India has a pretty well-established democracy at this point. It's been a democracy for a long time, but it doesn't necessarily have that effective or competent of a state. He gives us an illustration of this, the fact that so many people have such a poor education in India because of the, basically the unprofessional character of a lot of the public teachers, that teachers just don't show up oftentimes for work in places. So you have a kind of poor infrastructure, poor educational infrastructure there. So even though India has a democracy, that doesn't mean it has a good state, a state that can do the things that it's supposed to do. Now, for a lot of you, you might have come across this theme when talking about the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution, because this was one of Alexander Hamilton's major points in some of the early Federalist Papers, which is that the colonists were so concerned about limiting the powers of government during the Revolutionary period that the national government established by the Articles of Confederation was actually much too weak to do what it needed to do. Even the tasks that everybody agreed the central government should do, such as diplomacy and national security, it simply was incapable of doing because it wasn't given the capacities it needed in order to carry that out. And the Constitution is meant to remedy that by building a truly effective national state. Now, he moves on in the chapter to talk about, as he says, why governments are necessary. And here he's giving a relatively non-controversial kind of textbook list of the various tasks that governments can have, right? So the first one he says is to provide public goods. That is, for those of you who studied this, these are goods which are non-excludable and which also are not consumed when more people partake of them. So, a classic example here, and that's called being non-rivalrous, by the way. Classic example here is something like clean air. That when you have clean air, if the atmosphere is clean, you can't exclude particular people from partaking of it. You can't be like, well, the air is really, really healthy, except for the air around Joe, and it's really polluted. No, I mean, if the air is clean, then everybody in the area can partake of it. You can't exclude people from it. And at the same time, one person breathing clean air doesn't get in the way of somebody else breathing clean air. So that's an example of a public good. A public good is something that is non-rivalrous and non-excludable. And here the examples which are kind of infrastructural to a certain degree, examples he gives are public safety, national security, a functioning legal system, good national defense, clean air and water, etc. Now, obviously, if you dig into the details, there are ways in which these public goods can be rendered partially excludable, partially rivalrous, but we don't need to get into that. So one thing governments do is they provide public goods. Another thing they exist to do, as he says, is to manage externalities, the benefits or harms that accrue to third parties because of transactions between other parties. So something like pollution. Right. So you've got the people who say produce energy, you have the people that consume energy, but energy production can also produce pollution, and the costs of that pollution aren't necessarily borne by either the producers or the consumers of that energy. So for example, when you have the old coal plants that would produce electricity in the US, and then the air currents would bring some of that pollution up into Canada, and you'd have acid rain in Canada. So that's what's called like a negative externality, because you have people in Canada who are now incurring costs that are the results of a process between other parties. So governments are there in part to manage these externalities by regulating pollution, or also producing kind of positive externalities in various ways. So we'll get to that later. The third thing that he says government can be there for is to prevent or to remedy unjust informational asymmetries. This is where you get things like laws against insider trading or food and drug safety. So situations where one person or one party knows something that another party doesn't, and they can use that knowledge to take kind of unfair advantage of the situation. So you try to prevent that. Then also he talks about social regulation as a fourth task of government. This is on page 55. He talks about, governments want their citizens to be upstanding, law-abiding, educated, and patriotic. They may want to encourage home ownership, small businesses, gender equality, physical exercise, discourage cigarette smoking, drug use, gangs, or abortion. Most governments, even ones committed ideologically to free markets, end up doing things they believe will encourage investment and economic growth beyond the bare provision of necessary public goods, etc. So public policy of all sorts. So you've got public goods, externalities, informational asymmetries, social regulation, and then also, and probably most controversial, is redistribution. Right? The various ways in which governments redistribute the resources available within society. He gives, for example, actually equal protection of law, which he says actually, especially benefits the poor since they don't personally have the resources to ensure effective legal representation. But also various forms of social insurance, Social Security and things like that. And then also just generally the welfare state. And obviously, as he says, an overly active government can be inefficient or create moral hazard by disincentivizing work. But on the other hand, most people in the modern West tend to think that not having any kind of social safety net at all is unjust. It's immoral, that governments have a responsibility to provide some kind of basic social safety net for at least part of society. So that's another function. And obviously, this is a big source of debate, right? To what extent should the state be involved in redistributing the wealth in society? Now, he's not going to obviously weigh into that debate too much, but he's just noting that it's there. So really, when you're talking about the state, though, then you've got actually two interrelated questions that you're dealing with here. One question has to do with the scope of the state. So what all is the state responsible for, right? What are the tasks and how do you define them? So that's one thing you've got to look at when you're kind of assessing, well, what's this government? What's the character of this government? What is its scope? But then you also have to talk about its strength, which is to say its capacity to deliver on its various responsibilities. That's where you're talking about the quality of government, as opposed to the scope of its power. Because, a government could nominally have a very broad scope but do a terrible job of providing for most of it, whereas you might have another government with a very narrow scope but that's very competent. So these are two different dimensions, and so that's why when he's assessing kind of the quality of government, he tries to locate it along those two dimensions, scope and strength or quality. And this is what in figures 4 and 6 he illustrates. So figure 4 is where he illustrates, really, if you start figure 3 is where he has this illustration of the potential scope of state functions from minimal to extensive. And that's right there. And then figure 4, as he says, though, is that you can then take that scope. Here he takes out the terms but leaves the x-axis. And then you can have your y-axis, which is the strength of state institutions. So in other words, you've got your scope, but how competent are the states? And he relies ultimately on some World Bank measures for the effectiveness of various countries. And this is where this is illustrated right here in this figure 5, which you can look at for yourself. And then he collects it in figure 6 in this little box where you find a number of countries, and you can see Denmark there in the top, the US across from it with a more limited scope. So this is where you locate those states along those two dimensions. So it's an interesting way of doing it. Now, in terms of measuring the scope, he actually just uses a proxy measurement, which is the government spending as a percentage of GDP. And the assumption here is that the more of the wealth of the society that is spent by the government, that means the more things government's doing. So that's why governmental spending is oftentimes the proxy measurement for the scope of governmental responsibilities. So now, obviously, though, there is no non-controversial way to measure competence, because it's a qualitative measure, and coming up with sort of quantitative or empirical proxies for quality of government is inherently controversial, because however you operationalize it, your data is only going to be as good as the definition you give of quality, and people can disagree about that. But at any rate, so that's his brief discussion of the how he's going to talk about the scope and the strength of government and its tasks. So in the next lecture, I will talk about his discussion, his early discussion in Chapter 4 of Prussia, which will serve as one of his primary models in Europe of a country that developed a competent state.